So first of all, critical thinking, simply stated, is a method or a set of tools for assessing the trustworthiness of claims or arguments. It's a formal way for us to reason. Formal as opposed to informal, because every day, every minute of our lives, we're constantly reasoning things. You know, where should I go for lunch? What should I do before I leave for work? So these are all forms of reasoning, but it tends to happen automatically in our mind, and our mind uses a lot of heuristics built in through experience and maybe even through just standard psychology that evolved over time. But critical thinking allows us to take a step back and slow down for a second and then examine things and use proper logic in order to determine, well, what is actually the best course, or what is the best argument that we should buy into. So the most obvious way that critical thinking is used is for determining whether or not an argument is good or not. So whether or not the conclusion being put forth by the argument should be accepted. And we talk about this a lot on our podcast and in our group, the Ottawa Skeptics. It's pretty core to what we do, which is taking a look at different claims that people make and then assessing them. We have to first you have to figure out what the argument actually is. Okay, so a lot of times arguments can just be big, large rants, and it's really hard to figure out exactly the point they're trying to make. They're just, venting about something. So it might sound like someone's making an argument when they're actually just making a statement or even asking a question. And you might be very emotional at that point and want to argue against them, but there's no point in arguing against them if they're not even making a positive argument to begin with. So all arguments are made up of a few key things. Just like every proper sentence has a subject, a verb, and an object, well, every proper argument will have premises, logic, and a conclusion. If you don't have premises, logic, and a conclusion, you do not have an argument. Even bad arguments have premises, logic, and a conclusion. They might not have very good premises or logic, but they should have all those three things. So first on the list is premises. What is a premise? Well, the premise is the foundation of an argument. These are the things that should be preferably supported by evidence. So if you're talking about a scientific question, so it's a scientific argument, preferably the premises have some kind of evidence backing them up. Now, if you're having an ethics discussion, then the premises might not have any evidence behind it, but all the people in the debate should agree on the premises at least. Because if people disagree with the premises, then the argument is pointless. So it's very important that when you're analyzing someone's argument, you want to reconstruct it basically. So people argue using English, which is very, well, English people argue using English. I should say people argue using language, and language can be very clumsy, and arguments can appear out of the blue without stating the premises first. They might state the conclusion first and the premises last, or they might even be missing the premises and just implying what they are. So before you try to deconstruct and understand an argument, it helps if you actually try to reconstruct it. So you take what the person's saying and then you write out on a separate piece of paper, premise 1 equals, and then you write out what the premise is. And then you say premise 2 is this. And then you draw a line underneath it and you write the conclusion. And then using the symbols that you give to each premise and conclusion, you can draw a little graph off to the side representing the logic. So before we get into that too far, the conclusion I'd like to go over. So the conclusion is also sometimes difficult to make out, but it's very important that you pick out what the actual conclusion is, because it's hard to assess the strength of an argument without understanding what the conclusion is. And of course, the conclusion is the statement that the arguer wants to convince you of.
It's the fundamental assertion.
Right. So try to look at the paragraph or what the person's saying and try to figure out what are they trying to convince me of. They might not even be stating it. It could be missing. So that is what the conclusion is. And then, of course, what connects the premises with the conclusion is called logic. Now, even if the premises are true, they may not necessarily support the conclusion. And this may be because the logic is unsound. Logic can be either sound or unsound. Sound logic plus correct or true premises leads to a trustworthy conclusion. If either the premises are false or the logic is unsound, then the conclusion is not trustworthy. Question to you guys though. If the premises are false, but the logic is true, what can we believe about the conclusion?
from the argument itself, you can't believe necessarily much. The conclusion might be true, but the particular argument, if the premises are false, won't be.
Very clever, Darren. Yes, that's true. Just because a conclusion might not be supported by the given premises or the logic, it doesn't mean that the conclusion's false. It just means that it should not be accepted as true yet. So you should remain skeptical.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can say 2 plus 2. No, sorry. My example doesn't make... Yeah, you can have poor logic, you can have poor arguments, you can have poor everything. You can still be right. Even a broken clock's right twice a day, right?
Exactly. So if you disprove, or if you point out the flaws in someone's argument, it doesn't mean you've shown that their conclusion is false. You've just shown that they have more work to do in order to convince you of this conclusion. So, of course, logic can go wrong in many ways. We have discussed on the show many ways in which logic goes wrong, and these are called logical fallacies. So some very clever philosophers dating back all the way to the Greek era and up to current times are constantly figuring out these new fallacies, and there's just hundreds of fallacies. Most often, though, they can be categorized into one few very broad fallacies like non sequitur or circular reasoning or appeal to popularity, appeal to authority.
Or the ad hominem, like a recent episode we did on this podcast.
Right. In a lot of our earlier podcasts, we did a weekly logical fallacy. So there's just different ways that you can recognize when, even if the premises are true, that they don't support the conclusion. Just because acupuncture is really popular, it does not mean that acupuncture actually works.
And just because antibiotics are really popular,
that doesn't mean they work either.
I mean, they don't work, but it's not a good reason for which they do work, but they do work.
Right.
Is that confusing? Sorry.
It helps if the premises are supported by evidence, right? So you can say antibiotics are supported by quality scientific evidence showing that they have these following effects, and these following effects means that we can trust that they work.
In a good argument, as you said, the premises are supported by evidence, or they are facts or statements which everyone would accept as true just from a sheer reasoning point of view, if not evidence-based.
Right. So when you're entering a debate, or if you're just viewing a debate as a audience member or as a viewer, it helps to know a lot of facts. Because if you know a lot of facts, you can find out if premises are false. And if a premise is false, then you can ignore the whole rest of the argument because there's no lesson to be learned from it.
Actually, I will slightly object there.
Well, you might learn a bit about arguing and logic.
Yeah, and here's is just a general point that certainly when you're having debates with people, and if you're pursuing the critical thinking, skeptical mindset, you often have debates with a lot of people because a lot of things you can disagree with. But I've been reading a book about critical thinking, and one of the points they kept stressing was the principle of charity. That even if someone presents you a bad argument, if you're truly interested in what is true, it's almost up to you to make their argument better.
Yeah,
give them the better premises, give them the things they are missing, give them a better conclusion, and then argue against that. Because if what you care about what is true, it's not that a bad argument you can dismiss. That's kind of fun sometimes, sure, but that's not the point. You're trying to figure out what the issue is and if it's true.
There's also the issue of like people aren't usually thinking of the logic and and when they're stating their arguments or expressing their opinions. So often they'll just try and come up with all the evidence they can think of that can support their conclusion or their position, and some of that evidence might be false, but there may be other lines of evidence, like other premises, that can stand on their own to prove their conclusion. So they may just have additional preferences. They may have presented additional premises than what they